It's a great schus for me to introduce once again Moreno Rabbeinu, Harav Yitzchak Breitowitz.
Thank you, Rabbi Shor, for the very kind words, and also tremendous yasher koach, both to you and to the whole OU staff that's been working so hard to really bring Torah to the people, whether it's these special programs in Yerushalayim, Modi'in, other places, and Lahagdil Torah Ladira, and Be'ezrat Hashem, may you go mechoyel el choyel, and may more and more people participate in the tremendous Harbatzas Torah that the OU does, both in terms of live shiurim and in terms of online presentations as well. I was asked to talk a little bit about the inyan of Tekiyah Shofar. Obviously, the blowing of the shofar is the big mitzvah of Rosh Hashanah. We've been doing it the whole month of Elul, but that really is a minhag to kind of awaken us to tshuva. And as most of you probably know, we're not going to blow the shofar Wednesday. On Erev Rosh Hashanah, we do not blow the shofar to make a very clear demarcation between the optional shofar blowing of Elul and the mandatory shofar blowing of Thursday and Friday, lahafsik bein tekiyas rishus litkiyat chova. The meaning of shofar is not given in the Torah itself, and yet we know that it's a very multifaceted idea. Rav Saadia Gaon enumerates no fewer than 10 different aspects of tekiyat shofar. It's the alarm clock that wakens us up to tshuva. It is the summons to judgment. It is the coronation of the king. It's reminiscent of the receiving of the Torah. It is reminiscent of the future gathering of the exiles that'll be b'shofar gadol, resurrection of the dead. In a sense, it's connected to so many events in Jewish life, both in the past and in the future and in the present. There is shofar past, that is the shofar of Matan Torah. There is shofar present, coronation of God and summons to judgment. There is the shofar future, Techiyat HaMeitim, Mashiach, Kibbutz Goliath. And in fact, if you look in the section of Musaf that is devoted, right, the Musaf has 3 sections, one called Malchuyos, which are verses of kingship. One is Zichronos, that are verses of God remembering the good deeds of our forefathers. And then the third and shortest section is Shofarot, that deals with shofar. But it's interesting, although it is by far the shortest part of the Musaf. In fact, some have speculated there are some lines that are missing from Shofaret, because in some level it almost appears as if it was cut off at some point. But it's interesting that in the themes of the verses, it has the greatest diversity, because it does pick up past, present, and future, more so than the Malchios and Zichronos that are kind of monochromatic, dealing with a single aspect, God's Malchus, God's kingship, and God's memory. But I want to share with you maybe what might be regarded as off the beaten track aspects of shofar, going beyond the themes that are very, very familiar to us. You know, the Rav Saadia Gaon themes, which are very important and foundational. Virtually every machzor has them. The Art Scroll machzor, for example, has the 10 ideas of Rav Saadia Gaon. Obviously, it's very worthy of study. But I want to talk tonight of some themes that were developed in Chassidus and Kabbalah that are a little different than the listing of Rav Saadia Gaon. The first, interestingly enough, is not a Chassidish thought. It actually is from Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, which we normally would not call a Chassidic thought. But he makes the point that Rosh Hashanah commemorates the anniversary of the creation of man. Right? When we say Hayom Haratz Olam, today is the birthday of the world. When we say the world, we mean Yetzirat HaAdam. God actually began creating the world the 25th of Elul. Rosh Hashanah is the 6th day of creation. How did God create at least the spiritual essence of man? Vayipach bi'apav nishmat chayim. He breathes into Adam the breath of God. In fact, in many, many ways, This is already a very controversial theological issue, but the argument has been made that God did not create the soul. The human soul is not a created entity. The human soul is part and parcel of divinity itself. As the Zohar says, when you breathe into somebody, you are giving them your life force. Meaning God created cows and dogs and cats by V'yomer Elokim, let there be klavim, although that's not explicitly in the Chumash. But the human soul was not created by God saying, let there be a soul. The human soul was created by God breathing from his innermost essence. So on Rosh Hashanah, we commemorate the creation of man. So one way of looking at it is that the blowing of the shofar is hearkening back to that primeval breathing of a divine soul into man. It's a reenactment, so to speak, of the creation story. But then Rav Hirsch offers a startling and beautiful insight. Let's look at the sounds of the shofar. The first sound is a tekiah. A tekiah is a long, unbroken, clear sound. That represents the idea of the pristine, beautiful, radiant soul that God put into Adam Harishon on that first day of creation. The next sound is shavarim, that which is broken, disintegrated. That represents that through Chatoim, Adam Harishon, as well as us, we took a beautiful soul and we smashed it up. We broke it. But after the shvarim comes the TORAH, which is described as a crying sound. That is the cry of the Baal Tshuva, who seeks to come back to God. And what do you get after the TORAH? You get a tekiah, because through that process of tshuva, you repair the damage, and the soul is as pristine as it was when it first came into the world. So this is kind of a deepening idea. The idea that the shofar is the call to tshuva is a very familiar idea, but most of the time we look at it as an alarm clock. I mean, that's the standard way people interpret it. This is a bit of a richer idea, that you're reenacting all of these stages. The pure soul gets broken, but then as one cries and one comes back to God, it gets repaired. And I think Rav Hirsch points out that at least at the very end, the tekiah that is after the TORAH is longer at the very end than the tekiah before the TORAH. That is what is called tekiah gedola. It's interesting, tekiah gedola doesn't have to be super long. Tekiah gedola can be just a little bit longer, but in some places, for some reason, they make a whole, forgive my mixing the metaphor, a whole Megillah about it, where somebody blows the shofar like 5 minutes. It's unbelievable. You know, tekiah gedola doesn't have to be 5 minutes, but whatever it is, the remez of tekiah gedola, the standard explanation, once again, is it's a remez to the shofar of Mashiach, shofar gadol, that's the simple pshat. But in terms of this tshuva metaphor, it's a remez to the principle that the place where the Baal Tshuva stands is even greater and stronger than the tzaddik who didn't sin. So that's pshat number one. Again, a little different than we usually think about it, in which the blowing of the shofar is a metaphorical reenactment of the creation story, coupled with the potentialities of tshuva and restoration and rectification and tikkun to make something even stronger than it was before the sin. Okay, so that's pshat number one. Then I want to share with you pshat number two from Rav Hutner. And Rav Hutner starts off with an opposite premise. If Rav Hirsch views the initial blowing as a reenactment of God blowing into us, Rav Hutner points out it's really the opposite. God blew something into us, shofar, we're blowing it out. So Rav Hutner actually says the shofar is a symbolic death experience. What is going on? So some of you might remember in the days before computers, when you would rent a car for 5 days, and you wanted to extend it by 1 day, you would have to, there was like a whole ceremony for some reason. You couldn't even do it on the phone. You had to personally show up. You had to hand, I don't know why, you had to hand them the keys, and they would sign a new contract, and then they gave you the keys again. There was like a ceremony that before you could get a new term, you have to kind of terminate and end and cancel the old term. It probably comes from 18th century English law or something like that. You can't make a new contract till you formally cancel the old contract and the like. Rosh Hashanah is very much that way. God gives us life in 1 year increments. That's how it works. Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, God decides, Bezrat Hashem, we'll have life. But it's 1 year at a time, because next Rosh Hashanah is going to be a new Yom Adin. So essentially what the shofar is doing is, the shofar is returning the car. I'm giving back my life to God, and I'm asking for a renewal. But, now the Shvarim Trua would be the tshuva process in which I'm making the case for my renewal. That would be similar to Rav Hirsch. So on one level, it's a symbolic death experience, which is very important for us, because we do have to realize that our prayers in Rosh Hashanah are very, very significant. Again, without bringing up, I don't want to bring up depressive and sad things, but what the tragedy of October 7 or Shmini Atzeret, whichever date you want to call it, that was decreed. That was decreed on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur of 5784. We didn't know that. We didn't suspect it. But in retrospect, you could see how absolutely pivotal those days were. Imagine, had we known last Rosh Hashanah that a tragedy was in the offing and we had some mechanism, who knows, that we could avert it, how much we would have done, how much we would have tried. So the notion of understanding that we're giving our lives to God is very important, because it gives a person a sense of the reality of what is in stake on Rosh Hashanah. Now I hasten to add, I do have to add, just as a little bit of a counterbalance, that it's true that one cannot deny what is called Eimat Hadin, the fearsome din of Rosh Hashanah. This is certainly a major theme in the Sanat Tokef. The Sanat Tokef is probably the most famous prayer in the Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur Machzor. There's a very famous story connected to Rav Amnon, who he tried to tell a Catholic bishop that he would talk to him, and just to get him off his back. And when he realized he was creating the wrong impression, he refused to go, and he had his arms cut off and all sorts of things. And in his last moments, he composed this prayer as he was dying. Whether the story of Rav Amnon is true or not true is a very, very interesting issue, and that's really a talk for another time. It may not have been true factually, but it did represent kind of a paradigm of the spiritual Mesirat Nefesh that existed over Jewish history. But whatever it is, Sanat Tokef certainly communicates very, very graphically the Eimat Hadin. But I also want to point out that Rosh Hashanah is also a joyous day. Look in the book of Nehemiah. One of the first Rosh Hashanahs after they came back, only a minority came back, after the 70 years of the Babylonian exile. And they come back to a land that is desolate, that is empty. They are impoverished. They have no source of parnasa. They are still under the rule of the Babylonians. I'm sorry, by that time the Persians. They're under Persian rule. They don't have freedom or autonomy. They don't have an economy. And They thought, in spite of the fact that they're back in Eretz Yisrael, they thought God rejected them. God is not pleased with them. And they were sobbing and weeping on that first Rosh Hashanah. And Ezra and Nehemiah circulated among the people. And Ezra and Nehemiah said, have a good meal and be sure to share with those who don't have. Rejoice, do not cry, do not mourn, for this day is holy unto God. It is important to counter maybe the over-nervous, over-anxious reactions that we have. I mean, obviously, Eimat Hadin is a truth that I cannot deny and I cannot obscure. We have to deal with it. But at the same time, we have to have bitachon in God's compassion, in God's goodness, in God's love for the Jewish people. To be optimistic, to be hopeful. Tragedies do happen. And each tragedy should rip our hearts, and we should pray and daven with all of our kavanah. But we also know that Am Yisrael Chai, Am Yisrael will live, and Eretz Yisrael will survive. So although, obviously when I talk about shofar, a lot of it is Eimat Hadin, but we also have to keep in mind the simcha aspect. In fact, Saadia Gaon himself balances this, because Saadia Gaon says the shofar is also coronation. Right? Coronation is joyous. B'chatzotzrot v'kol shofar hariu lifnei HaMelech Hashem. With trumpet and shofar, we shout joyfully before God. So Rosh Hashanah is a bit of a hard holiday because it's a little bit schizophrenic in the sense that it incorporates two different modalities that have to exist simultaneously. Take the din seriously. Tshuva, tefillah, tzedakah, the end of the Sanatokef. Ma'avirin es roah hagzeira. But at the same time, feel the joy of God's love. Feel the reality of God's compassion. And therefore, as we do tshuva, we do our tshuva with simcha as well. But going back to Rav Hutner, the shofar is the symbolic death of giving up the old life in exchange for the new life, the hopefully new life that God's going to give you. In fact, the Zohar explains this in a reciprocity. When we blow the shofar below, that elicits God blowing the shofar from above. It's mamish what it is. We're giving back the old car. We're getting a new car. So there are a number of things here. Number one, this image of shofar as death makes us realize, number one, the reality of divine judgment. Number two, this is an optimistic twist on it, the idea of renewal. Everything's new. New spiritual energy is reviving the world. The old energy is being given back. Things are new. So everything can change. Sometimes it may be ominous, but there's the potential for change in all positive ways. It's a new deal. It's a new game. It's a new life. In fact, interestingly enough, if you take the famous phrase that we recite after we blow shofar, Hayom Haras Olam. So every machzor translates it, this is the birthday of the world. Birth, Adam Harishon, the birth of Adam Harishon. Problem is, of course, that Haras comes from Herayon. Haras means pregnancy or conception. So how do you get birth from that? So some Meforshim twist it around a little bit. But there is an alternative way of understanding it. Instead of saying, this is the birthday of the world, it actually means this is the conception of the unfolding of a new reality that is coming into the world. It's not past looking. This is the birthday of the world is going backwards. This is the conception of a new reality is looking forward. And the truth of the matter is, this may sound like a real innovative translation, but the truth is, it is extremely faithful to the literal meaning of haras, which is connected to Herayon. So the death experience makes us realize the seriousness of Rosh Hashanah, but it also makes us realize the joy of new life. And finally, giving our life over to God is also a moral commitment. In other words, I'm basically pledging my existence to Hashem, which is part of the coronation motif of pledging allegiance to the Creator. Okay, so this is thought number 2 with a little elaboration. Right, so Rav Hirsch was Shofar as a reenactment of creation and the process of tshuva. Rav Hutner, Shofar as symbolic death of turning your life over to God. Explanation number 3 is based on the Sfas Emes. And here is an interesting point. The Mishnah says in Maseches Rosh Hashanah that all shofars, all animal horns, are kosher for the mitzvah of shofar. Our minhag is we use a ram, at least Ashkenazim use a ram's horn to remember the Akedas Yitzchak, but technically antelope, goats, and as you know, the big Yemenite shofars are from wild goats or wild gazelles. But the one animal whose horn is not kosher for a shofar is a perfectly kosher animal, the lowly cow or bull. All shofarot are kosher, but not the horn of a cow or a bull. What's wrong with a cow or a bull? So the Gemara gives a few answers. But the answer that's brought lahalacha is the idea that since a bull or a cow is reminiscent of a calf, golden calf, so we have the famous phrase that's even entered modern Hebrew, Ein kategor naseh sanegor, which means a prosecutor who is trained to look for all of the flaws is not the best one to try to defend you because he sees all the negatives. You don't go before God on the day that you're pleading for mercy and shake before God reminders of the golden calf. Now, obviously, the issue is not that, oh, God didn't remember. Gee, I didn't remember that till I saw it. I mean, of course Hashem remembers it. But there's a certain arrogance in brandishing your ego reminder. And that is why we don't use a cow or a bull horn. Now, it's interesting, the Gemara gives another analogy where this concept comes up again, and that is on Yom Kippur. Normally, the Kohen Gadol's uniform, the normal begadim that the Kohen Gadol wears, contains gold thread. On Yom Kippur, when he goes into the Kodesh HaKodashim, he only wears pure white linen. He does not enter the Kodesh HaKodashim with gold. Why not? So the Gemara says, because gold is also a reminder of the Chet HaEgel, Ein kategor naseh sanegor. So now, the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah asks a very interesting question. So we have 2 contexts where we invoke Ein kategor naseh sanegor. One is the pasul of a cow horn for shofar, and the other is not wearing gold. By the way, that custom of not wearing gold is indeed, even though it only applied in the Kodesh HaKodashim, but it is a fairly strong minhag Yisrael that gold jewelry is not worn on Yom Kippur for that reason. Some people allow white gold because the egel was yellow gold. Ask your local rabbi, what his psak would be on that particular issue. In fact, the makor of wearing white is the same reason, as whether men wear kittel and women also. Again, it's not a chiyuv. It's not a chiyuv for women to wear white, but it's a very common custom that's connected once again to the Kohen Gadol entering the Kodesh HaKodashim as sign of purity. Now, these 2 halachic categories, the shofar of the cow and the big day kahuna of the Kohen Gadol, They seem to be consistent. But the Gemara says, actually, it's not consistent. Because, the Kohen Gadol switches his uniform 5 times on Yom Kippur. He goes from gold, white, gold, white, gold, white. Whenever he's in the Holy of Holies, it's white. Outside of the Kodesh HaKodashim, he wears gold. So wait a second here. Even on Yom Kippur, the rule of Ein Kateger Nasas Neger only applies in the Kodesh HaKodashim. So how come it applies to Shofar? I'm not blowing Shofar in the Kodesh HaKodashim. If the Kohen Gadol could wear gold when he's not in the Kodesh HaKodashim, why can't I blow a cow's horn for Shofar? The Gemara asks the kasha. So what the Gemara gives, quite an amazing answer. The Gemara's answer is essentially that when you blow the shofar and you are remembered by God, it is as if you are standing in the Kodesh HaKodashim that moment. And therefore, the Kodesh HaKodashim rules apply at the moment of shofar blowing. Can you imagine what that's saying? The Kodesh HaKodashim was a place in the Beis HaMikdash where only one person was allowed to enter only one day a year. Kohen Gadol, only on Yom Kippur. And yet, when thousands of Jews come together to hear the shofar, the moment of that Tekiyat shofar, we are in the Kodesh HaKodashim. And that's why the Gemara says the Ein Kateger Nasa Sanego rule, which normally does not apply when you're not in the Holy of Holies, will apply to Tekiyat shofar. That's the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah. All of this is the Gemara. So now the Sfas Emes builds on this Gemara. If it is true that the moment of shofar blowing, we are in the Kodesh HaKodashim, and if it is true that in the Kodesh HaKodashim, you can only bring the pure part of yourself. You don't bring any sins in with you. That's why we have to blow a shofar and not verbalize our prayer. The shofar, says the Sfas Emes, is a prayer without words. It is a prayer that emanates from the guts. It's a prayer that emanates from my insides, my kishkas. Meaning, a verbal prayer is not acceptable in the Holy of Holies because our very speech is filled with hypocrisy, with hidden agendas, with insincerity. Because by the time it gets to our mouth, our verbalization, it no longer has the fullest integrity. We say to God, I'm sorry and I did that. Are we really sorry? Not always. So in the Kodesh HaKodashim, you don't bring your speech. You don't bring your words. You don't bring your hypocrisies. Yes, Hashem will listen to us the rest of the day, and we try our best. But in the Kodesh HaKodashim, you got to bring that which is pure and good and untainted. And that is the innermost depths of your soul. Because the soul of a Jew is holy. The soul of a Jew, the Pinto Yid, does not get contaminated by sin. It gets covered up with dirt, schmutz. It gets covered up. But it's essential. It's like a diamond being covered with all sorts of filth. But the diamond itself does not absorb that filth. In fact, that is why tshuva works. The reason tshuva works, if somebody was really broken, there might be no way to fix it. But if we understand that neshama remains pure, that is the basis of all recovery. To clean off the layers. You know, I had a memory of something that I remembered when I was 6 or 7, and for many, many years, I said to myself, I'm sure you have this experience, my memory must just be wrong because it's impossible. when I was 6 or 7, I normally davened in a young Israel with my parents in Hartford, not West Hartford, Hartford. But one year, for whatever reason, my parents went to a Yeki shul, a German shul. And, I was 6 or 7, so being in these long shul things were not the most pleasurable experience. And even today, I have to admit, sometimes it's not the most pleasurable experience. But one thing that I was curious about is when they said the al-chaitz of Yom Kippur, the al-chaitz, the list of all of the Averos, they sang it to a very jaunty melody, a happy melody. Al-chait this, al-chait this. And I said to and I remembered this, but as the years went on and I experienced so many other Yom Kippurs, I said, can't be. It can't be. I mean, maybe you must have been thinking of something else, maybe one of the slichos after Kol Nidre or something. They couldn't have sung the al-chaitz to a jaunty melody. But then I read Rav Pinchas Peli, Zichrono Livracha, his adaptation of Rav Soloveitchik's Shiurim on Tshuva, again a wonderful book, Hebrew or English. It's worthwhile to get, in which Rav Soloveitchik was describing his Yom Kippur in Berlin. And he said he was surprised that in Berlin they sang the al-chaitz to a jaunty memory. And I read that and I felt vindicated. Yeah, I was right. And he explained, Kedarko, with beautiful eloquence, that, when you clean off the dirt, when you have a beautiful diamond, and you remove all of the filth, even though it might be very uncomfortable dealing with unpleasant things, but you're exposing the beauty of the diamond. So al-chait can be a joyous experience. I'm cleaning everything up. I'm fixing everything. I'm making everything beautiful again. So even the al-chait can be b'simcha. Now, I don't know if they do this in Washington Heights. Washington Heights is the minhag of Frankfurt, which is Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch's kehila. This, both when Connecticut and Rav Soloveitchik was talking about the minhag of Berlin, which are actually two different Yaki minhagim, but at least in Berlin, the minhag was that they sang the al-chaitz. So it turns out that the shofar is a prayer to God. But it's a prayer without the hypocrisies, without the insincerities of speech. It's a prayer that comes from a deeper place than speech. It comes from the essence of holiness. That is the pintoliyit. And why do I need that type of prayer? Because in the Holy of Holies, you don't bring in the egel, you don't bring in any sin. You got to give God what is pure and good. And that is your essence. That is your essence. Again, those of you that have learned the Tanya know, again, Rav Shneur Zalman was not the first person, but again, with great eloquence and depth and detail, he describes the intrinsic holiness of the Jewish soul and how sin might create an incrustation. Yeah, and that may separate you from God until you remove the incrustation. But it does not affect the essence of that neshama. And that is the basis of tshuva. So far, 3 ideas. The shofar as reenactment of creation, culminating in tshuva. The shofar as symbolic death. The shofar as wordless prayer emanating from the purity of the soul. A final interesting thought is from another great Hasidic master, the Shem Mishmuel, the son of the Avnei Nezer. And he points out that although the Torah does require a long sound and a broken sound, Shvarim, Shvarim, Trua, the Torah itself does not assign any meaning for it, meaning all the drushas we make are interpretations, but the Chumash itself does not give you a direct meaning. But there is one place where the Torah actually gives you the meaning of the sounds. And that is not in the case of shofar, But in the case of Chatzotzros, in the Mishkan and later in the Beis HaMikdash, in addition to the shofar that is sounded on Rosh Hashanah, there were silver trumpets that actually were blown every Shabbos, every Yom Tov, including Rosh Hashanah. This was part of the temple service, only in the Beis HaMikdash. And in Parshas Baloscha, when Moshe was instructed to make the silver trumpets, he was actually told what to blow depending on occasions. So it says, when you want to gather the people to come together, blow a tekiah. And when it is time to journey, blow the TORAH, blow the broken sound, which includes shvarim, truas, etc. So, if we allow a little bit of poetic license, that we can take the meaning the Torah gives in Chatzotzros and apply it to shofar, we get yet another meaning in the tekiah, shvarim, trua, tekiah. Tekiah is gather together, come together. The Jewish people need achdus. The Jewish people need unity. You know, those of you who remember, I'm sure everybody remembers, before October 7, when externally things were relatively peaceful, the state of Israel was undergoing a great crisis. I mean, we've forgotten it. The later tsaras are so much greater. We forgot about the earlier tsaras. But the earlier tsaras was bad. Judicial reform, whatever the issue was. It was tearing apart the country. Religious, secular, within the secular world, within the religious world. People were threatening to pull capital out of the country. Chayolim were saying they would not report for duty. Certainly Miluim, reservists were saying, Baruch Hashem, they all did when that became necessary, but who knows if that emboldened? Who knows? So there was tremendous sinas chinam, tremendous hatred, tremendous polarization. And then came October 7th. And if we could talk about a tiny silver lining in such a devastating tragedy, and maybe it's not proper for me to talk about it in those terms, but there was a renewed commitment, which often happens in the wake of tragedy, unfortunately, of unity, togetherness. All the machloksim were put aside. Religious and secular embraced. They walked together, they worked together. Even Charedim, who normally might not have participated in the army, some enlisted, others were bringing food and medicine to Chayolim and helping out in different ways. And there was tremendous, tremendous unity in Ahavat Yisrael. Unfortunately, like an elastic band where even if you stretch it, when you let go, it comes back, and as the milchama lasts and goes on and on and on and on, and then we have new problems from the north, although Baruch Hashem we had a bit of Yeshua the other day with Nasrallah. We go back to our bad habits, and a lot of the unity that we gained in the immediate aftermath of this awful massacre, we've kind of lost. And that's a tragedy on top of a tragedy. Because the tragedy was, of course, October 7 and the Chatufim and the war and everything else. And the second tragedy is we didn't even grow from it. We're back to where we were. So tekiah, as we see by Chatzotzros, is come together as you face a new year. As you face new challenges, come together. And when we have that tekiah, we're ready for the TORAH, which is the sign for traveling. Go forward. Come together, journey forth. And the Shemesh Shmuel says, he has a nice knech. He says, the TORAH sound, the shvarim sound, I'm using them interchangeably because they are the broken sound, can either be a laughing sound or a crying sound. Laughing and crying are closer than we sometimes think. You laugh till you cry till you laugh. And confronting a new year is a combination of laughing and crying. We laugh because it's new. The possibilities are infinite. Everything can change. As I said before, new spiritual energy comes in. But it's also frightening. I don't just mean in terms of the very bad things that can happen, but anything. All change is frightening. A new job, making aliyah, whatever it is. The notion of newness is frightening. So the emotional idea that I'm crying and I'm laughing very much describes the journey into newness that Rosh Hashanah represents. But you can't make that journey without the tekiah, which is achdus and unity and togetherness. Okay, so these are some ideas to think about. Again, just to summarize them as a list. Rav Hirsch, reenactment of creation, coupled with tshuva. Rav Hutner, symbolically dying and giving your life back to God in exchange for God's new energy. The Sfas Emes, a wordless prayer from the holiness of your essence in the Holy of Holies. And the Shem Mishmuel, the journey into newness, which is a combination of laughing and crying, but only after the tekiah, which is coming together. If we don't come together, we will not be able to make that journey. That journey requires that Klal Yisrael be together. 5784 was a hard year. Now, I'm not going to say it was a singular year. Unfortunately, we've had many, many years of tragedies that even were much, much greater. But the point is not to compare tragedies. It was a tough year, a rough year. And for those who are suffering, it is not over yet. And for those of us who feel the suffering of those who are suffering, it's not over yet. But there's an old saying, Tichle shana ukloseha. May the year and its curses end. Tochel shana ubirchaseha. May the new year begin with blessings. May Tavshin Pehei be a year of blessing. And I just want to end with a very pointed word of the Ibn Ezra. When Hashem promises us that if we're faithful to the Torah, v'nasati shalom ba'aretz, I will give peace in the land. The Ibn Ezra adds one word, v'nasati b'tochechem shalom. The prayer is not only peace from Hamas and Hezbollah. Of course, we need that. But b'tochechem, the peace should be within all of us. Shana Tova, Ksiva v'chasima Tova.